In early 2012, Anchorage, Alaska, was in the middle of a typical winter routine. Businesses opened and closed on schedule, and residents moved through their daily patterns despite the cold conditions. Among the many small workplaces operating in the city was a drive-up coffee stand on a busy street, staffed by young employees who worked evening shifts as part of the area's service economy. Late one night, a routine closing shift at that stand led to a missing person report that appeared straightforward at first: an employee who had not returned home. Within days, however, investigators identified details that did not match the initial expectations. What began as a local search effort would grow into a case that extended far beyond Anchorage and revealed information no one anticipated in its earliest hours. On February 1st, 2012, local police in Anchorage, Alaska, received a missing person report concerning an 18-year-old employee of a small drive-up coffee stand located along Tudor Road. The young woman had worked the evening shift, and when she failed to return home after closing, her family contacted authorities. She had no history of running away, and her absence was inconsistent with her usual routines. Officers began the standard procedure for newly reported missing persons, contacting friends, verifying last known communications, and visiting the workplace where she had last been seen. The coffee stand was a small enclosed kiosk illuminated by exterior lights and monitored by a surveillance camera facing the order window. The footage from closing time provided investigators with their first significant detail. At approximately 8 p.m., a male individual approached the window wearing a mask. The interaction between the employee and the individual appeared brief, and the footage showed the employee stepping back from the window and eventually leaving the kiosk with the man. Although the recording did not include audio, the sequence indicated compliance rather than visible resistance. Police secured the scene and collected initial evidence from the kiosk and surrounding lot. There were no signs of a struggle inside the stand. Officers found that the cash register contained a small amount of money, suggesting that theft had not been a primary motive. The employee's personal items were still in the kiosk, including her phone and bag. Investigators confirmed that she had not contacted anyone after leaving work. Friends and family provided police with her last communications earlier that day, none of which indicated plans to leave or meet anyone after her shift. She had been scheduled to work until closing and was expected home shortly afterward. When she did not return and attempts to call her went unanswered, her family immediately became concerned. The timing of their report coincided closely with the discovery of the surveillance footage, allowing investigators to begin establishing a timeline without delay. Police expanded the initial search to the surrounding streets and nearby businesses, asking for additional surveillance footage and witnesses who might have seen the masked man or any unusual activity. Anchorage residents in the area reported nothing out of the ordinary at the time of the incident. The parking lot surrounding the kiosk had no significant obstructions and no vehicles were identified as belonging to the suspect. Later that evening, officers located footprints in the snow near the kiosk, consistent with two individuals walking away from the stand toward a larger street. The prints suggested a brief pause, but did not provide enough detail to identify direction beyond the initial path. Weather conditions were stable enough to preserve some impressions, but vehicle traffic and plowing operations made further tracking difficult. Investigators also reviewed highway camera footage where available, though coverage was limited. They checked local taxi companies and transit routes for any fare or report consistent with transporting a masked individual or an adult woman matching the missing employee's description. None of the initial checks produced leads. By the end of the first 12 hours, police had a defined timeline and clear visual evidence of the employee leaving with an unidentified man. What they lacked was any indication of where the two had gone after moving beyond the view of the kiosk camera. As additional officers joined the search effort, the case was escalated based on the circumstances shown in the footage. Anchorage police continued contacting businesses, collecting data, and expanding the search perimeter. The disappearance quickly drew attention within the community due to the presence of the masked man and the employee's sudden absence. With the early hours producing limited, actionable information beyond the surveillance footage, investigators prepared for a case that had already moved beyond the scope of a typical missing person search. In the days following the disappearance, Anchorage police focused on establishing a detailed timeline based on surveillance footage, bank records, and communications data. The coffee stand recording provided a starting point, but investigators needed additional confirmation of the victim's movements after leaving the kiosk. Officers examined nearby businesses for usable footage, but most cameras either did not cover the street or did not retain recordings long enough for review. No additional visual documentation of the suspect or the victim was found in the immediate vicinity. Attention shifted to the victim's financial accounts. Within a short time, investigators discovered a withdrawal made from her debit card at an ATM late on the night of her disappearance. The withdrawal was small, but it represented a significant development. The suspect had possession of her card and was attempting to access cash. Anchorage police reviewed the ATM safety footage, which showed a man wearing a hood and gloves, maintaining concealment, similar to the individual seen at the coffee stand. The card holder was not visible in the recording. The ATM withdrawal allowed investigators to begin mapping the suspect's movement. The location of the machine placed the suspect within a defined radius for the first hours after the abduction. Detectives compared this data with the footprints found earlier, which offered a limited but consistent indication that the suspect had left the kiosk area on foot before accessing a vehicle. In the following days, additional withdrawals occurred from the same account, each in different states across the western United States. This pattern immediately shifted the nature of the investigation. What began as a local missing person case now involved interstate travel. Anchorage police contacted the FBI, and coordination began between multiple agencies. Each ATM location provided a new timestamp, allowing investigators to calculate approximate distances and travel times. ATM cameras captured similar imagery at each location. A masked or hooded individual standing alone, withdrawing cash quickly and leaving the area. The victim did not appear in any of the footage. Investigators noted consistency in the suspect's physical build, posture, and clothing across different states. Although these elements were not enough for an identification, they confirmed that the same individual was using the card. Detectives worked with the card issuer to track attempted withdrawals, some of which were declined. The pattern suggested a deliberate attempt to draw small amounts repeatedly, rather than a single large withdrawal. This behavior indicated a suspect aware of banking limits and monitoring systems. One significant early break occurred when an ATM camera in the lower 48 captured partial images of a vehicle near the machine. The footage was not clear enough to identify a plate number, but investigators were able to match the general make and model. Combined with travel time calculations, this gave law enforcement a rough estimate of the suspect's direction. FBI analysts examined the withdrawal pattern and concluded that the suspect was likely traveling by vehicle rather than flying. The distances between ATM locations supported this, and the timing between withdrawals suggested continuous travel along major interstate highways. Coordination with state police along those routes intensified, and officers were instructed to watch for drivers matching the loose description. As more withdrawals occurred, it became clear that the suspect was moving south and east. Each transaction narrowed the window of arrival at the next location. The FBI began cross-referencing data against car rental companies, fuel purchases, and hotel records. The suspect appeared to be moving at a steady pace, stopping only briefly to access cash. This ATM trail became the investigation's most valuable asset in the early phase. It provided consistent, verifiable data points, locations, times, and behavioral patterns that allowed the search to expand far beyond Anchorage. With each withdrawal, investigators closed in on the suspect's potential travel route, setting the stage for the eventual identification and apprehension that would follow. As the ATM withdrawals continued across multiple states, investigators were able to construct a progressively refined map of the suspect's movements. The pattern formed a distinct trajectory moving southeast through the continental United States. Because the victim did not appear in any of the recordings and no communication was made from her phone, law enforcement increasingly focused on identifying the person using her debit card. Anchorage police, federal agents, and state officers along the suspected route worked together to coordinate surveillance and patrol activity. The FBI obtained additional records showing the estimated times between withdrawals. Analysts compared these intervals with highway travel times to determine the suspect's likely speed and direction. The data indicated continuous long-distance driving with minimal stops. This consistency suggested a suspect experienced in cross-country travel, capable of covering extensive distances without leaving traceable digital or financial footprints aside from the ATM withdrawals. One ATM in Arizona provided footage that included more distinguishable vehicle imagery. Although the license plate remained unreadable, investigators identified the car as a white sedan consistent with a specific rental model. This discovery led agents to cross-reference rental car reservations made in Alaska shortly before the victim's disappearance. Out of the reservations reviewed, one stood out: a vehicle rented by a man named Israel Keys. Keys had flown out of Anchorage on a commercial flight days earlier. Records recovered later revealed that he had traveled to Texas, rented the vehicle there, and was making his way across the country. With this information, investigators began building a file on Keys, reviewing his travel history, prior residences, and financial activity. His movements aligned with the pattern indicated by the ATM withdrawals, and the rental vehicle he had chosen matched the one visible in the footage. Federal agents contacted Texas law enforcement, providing them with details about the ongoing investigation and a description of the rental vehicle associated with Keys. Officers in the area were instructed to be alert for the car, especially near locations where ATM withdrawals had recently occurred. This coordination expanded rapidly, involving state patrol units across Texas as well as federal agents positioned in Austin and adjacent cities. On March 13, 2012, the break investigators had been working toward occurred. A Texas Highway Patrol officer noticed a vehicle matching the description traveling near Lufkin. The officer initiated a traffic stop after observing a minor moving violation. When he approached the driver and requested identification, the man provided documents confirming he was Israel Keys. During the stop, the officer noted behavior that warranted further attention. Keys appeared calm but guarded. Inside the vehicle, the officer observed items that were inconsistent with standard travel, including a roll of cash and a cellular phone that later proved linked to the victim's ATM withdrawals. Additional officers were called to the scene, and Keyes was detained for questioning. Agents recovered the victim's debit card and her mobile phone inside Keyes' possession, confirming a direct connection to the disappearance. The rental vehicle also contained items that raised concerns, though investigators later released only general descriptions of what was found. Keyes was transported to a local holding facility, while federal agents prepared to interview him. The arrest marked a significant shift in the investigation. Until then, law enforcement had been following a trail of transactional evidence without knowing the identity of the suspect. Identifying and apprehending Keyes provided investigators with the opportunity to understand the motive behind the abduction and to determine whether the victim might still be alive. As federal authorities prepared for interrogation, they were aware that the man they had detained had traveled thousands of miles with little detectable activity beyond the ATM withdrawals. This initial traffic stop in Texas would ultimately open the door to a far broader investigation, one that extended far beyond the disappearance from Anchorage and revealed a history of criminal activity unlike any case investigators had previously encountered in the region. Following his arrest, Israel Keyes was transferred into federal custody. The FBI began conducting structured interviews designed to determine the victim's whereabouts, establish the full sequence of events, and assess whether additional individuals were involved. From the outset, agents noted Keyes' composed demeanor. He spoke clearly, responded directly when he chose to answer, and withheld information when he believed doing so benefited him. His manner was not confrontational but deliberate. Early in the interrogation, investigators presented Keyes with the evidence recovered from the rental vehicle, the victim's debit card and phone. Keyes acknowledged possession of the items but initially avoided providing detailed explanations. Agents pressed for the victim's location, emphasizing the urgency and the possibility she could still be alive. Keyes responded cautiously, showing no emotional reaction to the subject matter. Over time, as interviews continued across multiple sessions, Keyes began offering partial disclosures. He confirmed his involvement in the Anchorage abduction but provided information selectively, often framing details in conditional terms. Agents recorded each statement carefully, focusing on verifiable facts and avoiding speculation. During these sessions, Keyes' responses revealed planning and operational knowledge that aligned with the evidence recovered during the investigation. Federal agents also questioned Keyes about his interstate travel. He acknowledged crossing multiple states, but provided limited details on the purpose of his movements. Analysts later matched his travel route to the ATM withdrawal points, confirming that his account was consistent with the timeline constructed from bank data. Keyes offered no explanation for the pattern, beyond stating that he had been on a trip. As the interrogations progressed, Keyes showed an unusual degree of awareness of investigative procedures. He commented on surveillance cameras, ATM limits, and law enforcement response patterns. Investigators noted that he appeared to understand how evidence was tracked and avoided, suggesting a familiarity with evasion techniques. These observations shaped the FBI's approach in subsequent sessions, prompting them to structure questions around confirmed evidence rather than open-ended inquiries. At one point, Keyes shifted the focus of the conversation by indicating that his involvement in violent crimes extended beyond the Anchorage case. He stated this without prompting and in a manner that appeared calculated to redirect the interview. Investigators halted the session to examine how to proceed ethically and strategically. When questioning resumed, agents requested clarification, and Keyes repeated the assertion, again offering no specifics. Based on department protocol, agents emphasized that any disclosures would need to be substantive and verifiable. Keyes responded in measured terms, suggesting that he would provide information only under certain conditions. These conditions related primarily to how his case would be handled publicly. Agents documented his statements, but did not agree to terms beyond lawful investigative boundaries. During the interviews, Keyes also referenced locations he had visited in prior years. He did not describe crimes directly, but made indirect remarks that indicated familiarity with remote areas across various states. Later cross-referencing of his known travel history confirmed that he had visited multiple regions where unsolved cases existed. However, agents limited their conclusions strictly to what could be supported by evidence. Throughout the sessions, investigators maintained a structured, methodical process. Their goal remained identifying the victim's location and determining whether additional threats existed. Keyes continued to speak selectively, providing enough information to suggest broader criminal activity, but withholding details necessary to verify the extent of his claims. This pattern shaped the next phase of the investigation, during which agents began reviewing Keyes' past travel, financial activity, and known affiliations to understand the scope of his movements. The interrogation sessions marked a turning point. What had begun as a missing person case in Anchorage had now expanded into a multi-state investigation involving potentially undisclosed events. The information Keyes provided during these interviews would guide the next stages of the inquiry, shaping how federal and state agencies coordinated their efforts in the months that followed. As investigators continued reviewing Israel Keyes' statements and travel history, it became clear that his movements over the previous decade were extensive. Records showed that Keyes frequently traveled across the continental United States, often without clear personal or professional reasons. Agents examining bank and airline data identified a pattern of flights, rental cars, and long-distance drives that spanned a broad range of locations, including the East Coast, the Midwest, and the South. Keyes had maintained a relatively stable residence in Alaska for several years, yet his travel history reflected a lifestyle that involved frequent departures from the state. He often booked flights on short notice, rented vehicles upon arrival, and traveled long distances by road. Investigators noted that he favored cash transactions, limiting the digital recordings of his activity. When he did use cards, the transactions were typically small and did not indicate a clear purpose. During interviews, Keyes acknowledged that he had traveled extensively, but avoided providing specific dates or reasons. Agents focused on confirming his known movements through independent records. Airline logs showed that he made numerous trips to the lower 48 states, often selecting destinations far from major airport hubs. Rental car companies provided documentation showing that he routinely drove hundreds or thousands of miles during these trips before returning the vehicle at a different location from where he had picked it up. One detail that became relevant during the investigation involved buried containers later described by law enforcement as Audiobook kits. These containers were found in remote areas of several states. Each contained a mixture of items, tools, supplies, and materials that suggested planning and preparation. Federal agents documented the locations of these kits, but only some were recovered. Keyes did not disclose the full number or their exact placement, and investigators had to rely on their own searches and analysis to locate them. The presence of these containers indicated that Keyes had traveled to specific locations with the intent of returning at a later date. Agents reviewing his movements compared the known kit locations with his travel history, noting similarities between the sites and regions where he had spent extended periods. Some of these locations were near areas associated with unsolved cases, though investigators refrained from making direct connections without verifiable evidence. Keyes's travel patterns also reflected deliberate efforts to obscure his presence. He often booked flights under his own name, but limited his digital footprint once he arrived. Rental car logs showed varied drop-off locations, and in some instances he traveled without clearly documented lodging arrangements. Investigators determined that he sometimes camped in remote areas or stayed in low-profile accommodations that required minimal personal information. Agents also reviewed Keyes's service records from his time in the military. His training had included navigation, survival skills, and proficiency in moving through rural and forested environments. These abilities aligned with his demonstrated familiarity with remote landscapes during his travels. As part of their reconstruction, investigators created a detailed map of Keyes's travel routes, categorizing each trip by duration, expenses, and distance traveled. The result was a complex pattern showing sustained movement across much of the country over more than a decade. This pattern, combined with the limited information Keyes provided, posed ongoing challenges for investigators attempting to evaluate the full scope of his activity. While Keyes acknowledged involvement in crimes outside Alaska, he did not offer specifics about dates, victims, or locations unless pressed directly. Even then, his disclosures were limited. Agents documented each statement, but withheld conclusions until it could be supported by independent evidence. The review of Keyes' travel history marked one of the most extensive components of the investigation. It suggested a long-standing pattern of movement and preparation, but the lack of comprehensive disclosure from Keyes left investigators with partial information rather than a complete timeline. As the investigation expanded, federal agents began compiling a list of crimes confirmed through Keyes' statements, physical evidence, and verifiable records. While Keyes referenced involvement in multiple incidents across various states, he provided detailed information about only a select number. The FBI publicly confirmed these cases based on evidence that met the threshold for verification. One confirmed case involved a couple in Vermont who had disappeared several years prior. During interrogation, Keyes provided information that aligned with the timeline of their disappearance. Although he did not describe specific actions, he acknowledged responsibility for the incident in terms consistent with the evidence later reviewed by investigators. The details he provided matched certain known elements of the case, allowing agents to confirm his involvement without releasing sensitive information to the public. Another case tied to Keyes was the disappearance from Anchorage that had initiated the investigation. Through his statements, along with the evidence recovered in Texas and Alaska, investigators confirmed his role in the abduction. Keyes himself discussed aspects of the case during interrogations, and his statements aligned with the surveillance footage and the recovered items. As interviews continued, Keyes indicated that he had been active in various states, including Washington, New York, and Texas. He referenced specific years and travel periods, but avoided providing names or exact locations. Investigators compared his remarks with known missing person cases and unsolved incidents, identifying several potential matches. However, federal agents emphasized that no case would be attributed to Keyes without substantiated evidence. Public disclosures reflected only confirmed information, not areas of investigative interest. During a series of interviews, Keyes described his preference for selecting remote or lesser-traveled locations for his activities. He avoided using victim selection criteria beyond logistical opportunity and didn't provide ideological or emotional motivations. Investigators noted that his explanations remained limited to operational details rather than personal reasoning. The FBI later held public briefings outlining Keyes' confirmed movements and the known crimes attributed to him. These briefings focused on factual information, dates of travel, items recovered from caches, and investigative findings that aligned directly with Keyes' statements. Officials also emphasized the ongoing nature of the case, acknowledging that Keyes' movement suggested additional incidents that remained unverified. One challenge investigators faced was the incomplete nature of Keyes' disclosures. He occasionally provided information that pointed to events across multiple states, but he stopped short of offering details that would allow immediate verification. Agents believed this pattern reflected his intent to control the pace of disclosures and the direction of the investigation. His statements were consistent in tone, but limited in scope. Throughout the briefings, law enforcement maintained a strict focus on documented facts. The FBI did not release speculative conclusions regarding the total number of cases connected to Keyes. Instead, they highlighted the known timeline, confirmed cases, and the investigative process underway to identify additional evidence. By this stage of the investigation, it had become clear that Keyes' activities extended far beyond Anchorage, and that he had traveled extensively in the years prior. However, the confirmed cases remained limited to those supported by verifiable evidence. The process of matching his statements with data from across the country continued, with investigators emphasizing accuracy and avoiding assumptions about unconfirmed incidents. This stage of the investigation revealed the structured and deliberate nature of Keyes' actions, but it also underscored the challenges facing investigators. Without complete disclosure from Keyes, and with limited physical evidence from past events, the effort to determine the full scope of his activity remained ongoing. As the investigation advanced, federal agents shifted their focus toward constructing a comprehensive timeline of Israel Keyes' movements throughout the continental United States. This process required coordination between multiple jurisdictions, extensive record requests, and interviews with individuals who had encountered Keyes during his travels. His known trips, confirmed through airline data, rental car records, and financial statements, formed the backbone of the reconstruction. Agents charted Keyes' travel across numerous states, identifying periods during which he rented vehicles and drove long distances without clear documentation of his activities. The rental car companies provided mileage records which indicated that Keyes often covered more than 1,000 miles per trip. These distances exceeded what was typical for routine business or personal travel, prompting investigators to examine regional missing person cases and unsolved incidents along these routes. However, the FBI maintained strict criteria for linking any case to Keyes, requiring verifiable evidence and avoiding assumptions based solely on geographic proximity. One confirmed portion of the timeline involved Keyes' travel to the East Coast several years prior to his arrest. Records showed that he rented a vehicle in one state and returned it in another, covering a significant distance in the interim. During interrogation, Keyes mentioned visiting rural areas along his route, though he did not specify why. Investigators cross-referenced his statements with local records but found limited evidence linking these trips to specific events. In another instance, Keyes flew to Chicago before renting a car and driving into Wisconsin. He returned the vehicle days later, again with high mileage. These patterns repeated across several states: a brief flight, followed by extensive travel by road, then a return flight to Alaska, or another home base. This structure of movement complicated the task of determining his activities during these trips, as the gaps between verifiable data points often spanned multiple days. Investigators also examined Keyes' known stays in hotels and motels. In some cases, records existed showing brief overnight stays, while in other instances, no lodging information was found despite the long distances covered. This absence of documentation suggested that Keyes may have slept in his vehicle or camped in remote locations, consistent with other aspects of his behavior. Agents continued to analyze missing person cases along Keyes' routes, but many incidents lacked evidence to support a connection. The FBI emphasized that no unsolved case would be attributed to Keyes without confirmation. Nevertheless, the geographic overlap between his travels and certain open investigations led to ongoing review. During further interviews, Keyes referenced projects in various states. He did not elaborate beyond confirming that some of his trips were planned months or years in advance. Agents identified certain locations where Keyes had admitted burying containers containing supplies. These sites aligned with several of his earlier travel routes, strengthening the timeline. Investigators recovered some of these containers, which contained items consistent with preparation and planning, but did not provide direct connections to specific cases. The timeline reconstruction illustrated a pattern of long-distance travel, preparation, and deliberate movement. However, the absence of detailed disclosure meant that investigators had only partial insight into his activities. The map of confirmed locations ultimately formed a framework for continued inquiry, rather than a complete account of Keyes' movements. The lower 48 timeline represented an extensive but incomplete portrait of Keyes' mobility. While the confirmed data points were substantial, many intervals remained open to further investigation, reflecting the complexity of reconstructing events over more than a decade of sporadic, intentional travel. In the months following Keyes' arrest, agents conducted additional interviews with him in Anchorage. These sessions were designed to gather verifiable information and determine whether any immediate threats remained. Keyes spoke selectively, providing details in measured segments. He occasionally indicated willingness to disclose further information, but attached conditions relating to legal proceedings and media coverage. Investigators documented these statements while maintaining adherence to established protocols. Throughout these interviews, Keyes controlled the pace of information. He confirmed involvement in the Anchorage abduction and provided limited operational details consistent with evidence already recovered. He did not offer information voluntarily about additional cases unless prompted directly. Even then, his responses were concise, often limited to acknowledging involvement without naming individuals or locations. Agents noted that Keyes showed interest in how the investigation was progressing. He asked questions about what evidence had been discovered and inquired about procedural aspects of the case. This interest, however, did not translate into broader cooperation. His disclosures remained narrowly focused. During the legal proceedings, Keyes faced federal charges relating to the Anchorage abduction. Court records reflected the severity of the allegations, and hearings were conducted to determine the next steps in the judicial process. As part of these proceedings, Keyes was held at the Anchorage Correctional Complex, where he remained under close supervision. Investigators continued to examine Keyes' past movements, using any information gleaned from interrogations to cross-reference with missing person cases. They traveled to several states to review evidence, interview potential witnesses, and examine locations Keyes had mentioned. These inquiries produced limited new evidence, emphasizing the difficulty of confirming activities occurring years earlier in remote locations. Keyes's behavior during detention remained consistent with his interviews: quiet, controlled, and deliberate. He participated in conversations with investigators but did so on his terms. Agents worked to maintain communication with him, hoping to obtain additional verifiable details that could lead to closure in existing cases. However, his willingness to provide new information diminished over time. The final stages of the legal process were underway when Keyes' case took an abrupt turn. In December 2012, correctional staff found him unresponsive in his cell. Attempts to revive him were unsuccessful, and he was pronounced deceased. Authorities later confirmed that Keyes had taken his own life while awaiting further legal action. Keyes' death immediately altered the course of the investigation. Without the possibility of further interrogation, agents faced the challenge of completing the case using only the existing evidence, interviews, and recovered items. His passing also meant that crucial information about his activities across multiple states might never be disclosed. Following his death, investigators reviewed his writings and material found in his cell. These items were analyzed for potential relevance, though much of the content was not directly connected to specific cases. Public disclosures from the FBI focused on confirmed evidence rather than interpretive conclusions. The final stages of the case emphasized the limitations imposed by Keyes' selective cooperation and the lack of physical evidence connecting him to specific incidents outside the confirmed cases. Without further statements or newly discovered material, the investigation centered on preserving the accuracy of the existing record and assisting state agencies pursuing related inquiries. Following Israel Keyes' death, the investigation transitioned from an active interrogation-driven process to a long-term analytical effort. Investigators focused on consolidating the verified evidence, clarifying timelines, and reviewing potential connections to unsolved cases across the country. Without Keyes' participation, the final understanding of his activities would need to rely strictly on documented facts, existing records, and confirmed forensic findings. The FBI's post-investigation work began with a comprehensive audit of Keyes' travel, financial activity, and recorded behaviors. Analysts reviewed every available data point: airline bookings, rental agreements, cell tower connections, bank statements, and hotel receipts. These records provided a network of confirmed movement, but did not fill the gaps created by Keyes' selective disclosures. The absence of digital activity in many instances, especially in remote regions, complicated the task. Some intervals of travel could be confirmed only through secondary evidence, such as fuel purchases or vehicle return logs. Agents also re-examined the containers Keyes had buried in multiple states. These caches revealed items consistent with preparation and planning, but they did not include objects linking him to specific incidents. As a result, while the existence of the containers confirmed deliberate activity, their contents did not provide new information that could be used to resolve unsolved cases directly. One of the central challenges investigators faced was determining which unsolved incidents across the country potentially aligned with Keyes' movements. Although some missing person cases geographically overlapped with known travel routes, the FBI maintained its position against drawing conclusions without evidence. Publicly, officials reiterated that the number of confirmed cases remained limited and that other incidents, while under review, could not be connected without supporting documentation. Following the conclusion of the official proceedings, the FBI conducted briefings to summarize investigative findings. These briefings highlighted several points: Keyes' broad travel history, his use of preparation caches, his methodical approach to planning, and the selective nature of the information he provided. Officials emphasized the unprecedented combination of mobility planning and operational secrecy present in the case. Local agencies across the country continued to compare evidence from their own unsolved cases with the established Keyes timeline. Some departments identified potential overlaps and consulted with the FBI, but unless physical evidence or verified statements supported a link, these inquiries remained open and unconfirmed. The lack of definitive material limited the ability to close older cases based solely on circumstantial similarities. The Anchorage investigation remained the most thoroughly documented portion of Keyes' known criminal activity. The timeline from the coffee stand to his arrest in Texas could be reconstructed with precision using surveillance footage, financial records, and witness statements. This case served as the central anchoring point for understanding Keyes' behavior and operational methods. The confirmed case in Vermont also provided verified context for earlier activities, though it represented only one segment of what Keyes indicated was a broader history. Keyes' death left numerous unanswered questions. Investigators could no longer pursue clarifying interviews, request detailed explanations, or encourage disclosure of additional information. The lack of further dialogue also meant that possible connections to other incidents might never be substantiated. Federal agents documented the limitations of the investigation, noting that the absence of additional evidence prevented the resolution of numerous inquiries. Despite the challenges, the investigation produced several long-term outcomes. First, it provided clear documentation of Keyes' operational patterns, which were later used in law enforcement training to highlight the challenges posed by individuals who minimize digital footprints and plan extensively across multiple jurisdictions. Second, the investigation reinforced the importance of interagency communication. Without rapid coordination between local police, state patrols, and the FBI, Keyes' arrest might not have occurred as quickly. The case also prompted broader discussions about missing person investigations in regions with limited surveillance infrastructure. Although several ATM recordings and the coffee stand footage were pivotal, the gaps in coverage reflected the difficulty of reconstructing movements in areas without comprehensive monitoring. This led to procedural reviews in multiple states regarding how to respond to missing person reports involving possible interstate travel. In the public sphere, the case remained notable for its combination of confirmed facts and unresolved elements. Keyes' anonymity prior to his arrest, his extensive mobility, and his selective cooperation contributed to an enduring sense of incomplete understanding. However, law enforcement emphasized that the investigation's conclusions were based strictly on what could be verified. Without further evidence, the full scope of Keyes' activity could not be defined. Today, the Israel Keyes case stands as one of the most complex, multi-state investigations involving an individual whose operational methods left minimal traceable evidence. The confirmed timeline reflects extensive preparation, deliberate planning, and a broad geographic range. But the absence of complete disclosure means that the investigation remains partially open. Federal and state agencies continue to evaluate unsolved cases when new information arises, but the limitations imposed by the existing evidence remain substantial. In the end, the case underscores the difficulty investigators face when dealing with individuals who intentionally minimize their digital and physical footprints. Keyes' mobility, his planning, and his selective communication created an investigative landscape shaped as much by what was known as by what remained undisclosed. With his passing, the opportunity to clarify these gaps disappeared, leaving investigators with a structured but incomplete record of his activities, a record that continues to serve as both a reference and a reminder of the constraints inherent in complex, multi-jurisdictional cases.